Everybody, for Psalm 60. I have chosen a strong title taken from the psalm, to drink wine of poison. I will look at that phrase that accuses God, or if you will, describes God as having given the people a yayin tar'elah, and ra'al is poison in modern Hebrew. But we're going to focus in on the ambiguity of that phrase and the phrase which comes immediately after. You showed your people hardship. You gave us to drink wine of poison. And then continuing, you once gave those who feared you a banner to display because of your truth. So those two phrases at the middle of this psalm will be a particular focus. But let me begin with reading the psalm and then taking the time together to talk about some of those key verses. You made us drink wine of poison. Psalm 60. For the conductor of Shushan Edut, a michtam of David to teach, when he struggled with Aram Naharaim and Aram Tzova, and Yoav returned, smiting Edom in the valley of Salt, 12,000. God, you abandoned us, dispersed us. You were angry. Restore us. You made the earth quake. You cracked it open. Mend its fissures, for it is collapsing. You have shown your people hardship. You have made us drink wine of poison. You gave those who fear you a banner to display. For the sake of truth, Selah. So that your beloved be set free. Deliver with your right hand and answer me. God spoke in holiness. I shall exalt. I will divide up Shechem and the valley of Sukkot. I will apportion. Mine is Gilead and mine is Manasseh. Ephraim is the might of my head. Yehuda is my scepter. Moab is my wash basin. Upon Edom I will fling my sandal. Over Philistia I shout out exultantly. Who will bring me to the fortified city? Who will guide me to Edom? Is it not you, God, who has abandoned us? And you who does not go forth, God with our armies? Give us help against the foe, for futile is the deliverance of a mortal. Through God we shall act valiantly, for God will trample our foes. Now, the psalm does not indicate when it was written, but it seems to be in the midst of war all around. Aram Naharaim, Aram Tzafon are a description of battles in all directions for Israel. And there are references in the second book of Samuel describes David's kingship. So 2 Samuel 8, 3-6, and then 12, 2 Samuel 10, 6-19 describe battles with these opponents and with his general Yoav going to war against Edom to the southwest of Israel, what would be Jordan today. And those are repeated in 1 Chronicles chapter 19, verse 6. So in David's rule, David, will be fighting on all fronts. He will ultimately prove successful, so that David, in contrast to Solomon, will be a warrior king, which is why he'll be told that he is not suitable for building God's home in Jerusalem to be a symbol of peace. And so this is a description of a phase of David's rule that is correlated with those descriptions in, again, the second book of Samuel and Chronicles. But many commentators, both traditional and current, point to two things about this psalm. It seems to be in the middle of the fighting. Perhaps some defeat of significance has already occurred, which might be this reference to, you have shown your people hardship, which can also be, you have shown your people harshness. You have made us drink wine of poison, which others, like Robert Alter, translates for yayin tar'elah as harsh drink. The Art Scroll has it as benumbing drink, that the battles have been of such loss in the Art Scroll understanding that the people are numbed at this point to the pain. But the literal translation, which is found in many of the translations, is a drink wine of poison, as if the failure in battle was also due to God's judgment. And that would be, classic theology, that victories are due to God and defeats are too. And in this case, the people have been defeated as if having drinking a poison that held them back from being at their strength. Here's another interesting translation to verse 5. This is Richard Levy, who again was in charge of the Hebrew Union College in Los Angeles, the Reformed Seminary, and he just passed away about a year ago. A wonderful man with a wonderful commentary. He translates 5 and 6 as follows. You forced your folk to face hard things. You filled them full with wine till they falter in their steps. Now he's being more, if you will, playful rather than literal in his translation. Listen to King James Version, which for them is verses 3 and 4. To, again, these two lines, 5 and 6. Thou hast shewed thy people hard things. Thou hast made us to drink the wine of astonishment. Thou hast given a banner to them that fear thee, that it be displayed because of the truth. And that verses 5 and 6 lead to what became for me something to explore in a little greater depth. And that's verse 6, though soon I'm going to come to verse 8, which is an oracle. But before we get to verse 8, let's look again at the structure. Verse 1, an introduction. We don't know what this instrument is of Shushan Edut. There's a description in verse 2 of enemies all around, north, south, and the verse 3, 4, and 5, a description of defeat in a battle. And then verse 6, I translate it as, you gave those who fear you a banner to display for the sake of your truth, Selah. Verse 6 in that regard seems to me to be a bridge to verse 7 and what will come after. Look at verse 7. So that your beloved be set free, deliver with your right hand and answer me. So verse 6, this banner, seems to be a description of what it means to be faithful to God. That in being faithful to God, a key theme, creates the hope in verse 7 that we who are God's beloved, because we carry this banner, and I put it in quotation marks as if that's what's written on the banner for the sake of truth, was one can imagine the troops going into war, either literally or figuratively. What they display is their faith in God, who is identified with truth. So let me first play with how I imagine this. This is a description of a reminding God that even though we have had this defeat, there are more battles to fight. And what we carry into banner is our faith in you for the sake of truth, which means for the sake of God. Because God, and again, this is now homiletical in terms of it not being, if you will, a literal, obvious explanation, but God, for the rabbis later and even early, is identified with this word truth. In the Talmud, they will say that it is God's signet. And again, a signet, think of a signet ring, is what became your emblem, what you became identified with. And truth is a recognition of faith. When somebody dies, now I'm going forward in time, the expression of the rabbis is Baruch Dayan HaEmet, blessed be the true judge. And again, the word there is emet. That's what qualifies, describes the nature of God's judgment, which is to say here, for the sake of truth, going into battle, a statement of whether we are victorious or are defeated, we trust in your judgment. We trust in you because we see you, God, as a God of truth, of loyalty and kindness. The word emet is all-encompassing. Literally, it's the first, middle, and last letter of the Hebrew alphabet. In that sense, it's all-encompassing. What could be said about God? And I'll also add, it's, if you will, the word emet in Hebrew, it's a conflation, a putting together of aim and met, mother, birth, and death. It encompasses the whole of life, this word emet. And so when we say of God, you are the God of truth, or in this case, mipnei koshet, for the sake of truth, we're saying that you, God, are all-encompassing, reliable, and trustworthy. Now, having done that riff, and why I see this, as did Richard Levy, as what's on the banner, I will tell you that the word in Hebrew, koshet, only appears twice in the entire Bible. It appears here and one other place, which is in Proverbs. And in Proverbs, it says that, wait, I think I even marked it. Well, the phrase in Hebrew is, Lohodiacha koshet amre emet, to inform you of the truth, to inform you of truly reliable words. That's the JPS translation, which there translates koshet as reliable. So I'm just going to drill down for just a moment with an eye on the clock. The word koshet, interestingly, as I looked at my different translations of Hebrew, I found, which is unusual, that different Hebrew texts also give different vowels to koshet. So in the Mitsuda, it's kishet, not koshet. Mostly, like in Jewish Publication Society, it's koshet. And again, that's because there are no vowels in the Bible as written. And so these are later scribal notations. And there's not even a consensus as how do you dot the koshet in terms of the vowels, because it only appears twice here for the sake of truth. And in the context of Proverbs, the other place, it's actually dotted different. It's kosht. So not koshet, but kosht. And it's in the context of kosht imre emet. So this word kosht is identified with emet, the normal word used for truth. And so in the concordance, it's understood as being a synonym for truth, but it can also suggest, as it does in Proverbs, or at least understood by JPS, as truly reliable. So kosht is God is reliable, but a reliability identified with truth. But let me share with you, because I shouldn't still at this point with Psalm 60 still be so surprised by how differently people translate so as to have different understandings totally of a verse. That's the case here with the nature of this banner, which, by the way, the word banner in Hebrew, nes, also can mean a test, like Abraham in the Parsha last week, right? Adonai nisa et Avraham, nisa, tested Abraham. And the Targum will say, the Targum is the earliest, among the earliest of the translations from Hebrew into Aramaic. It will link this as the test of Abraham. So if you will, for the sake of Abraham's test, which is to say, God, remember our merit of our ancestor. So it's not just a banner, it's a test. And I'll also add the word nes will become in Hebrew, or is in Hebrew, also the word for miracle. Here's some different translations. Mitsuda, which punctuates this as keshet, a little different Hebrew punctuation, a test by which to be proven for the sake of your truth, so that battles are seen as tests of loyalty to God. Here's JPS, give those who fear you because of your truth a banner for rallying. Robert Alter, a banner for rallying because of the truth. The translation of Chabad, a banner to wave because of your truth. And just a couple more. Richard Levy, you have given those in awe of you a banner to rave aloft for the sake of your truth. Martin Cohen, now give them a banner to those who fear you so that they may wave it as their insignia. This last comment about the word koshet, because it's such an obscure term, Samson Raphael Hirsch, the rabbi of the 19th century Frankfurt, Germany, who in the midst of a changing Germany of giving Jews the right to vote, became the one who became the spokesman for what would become later known as modern Orthodoxy. And he will write that Keshet is actually derived from a Chaldean term for truth. And then we'll cite the selection from Proverbs. And back to test, there's a commentary that koshet comes from tachshit, which is spelled different in Hebrew but sounds similar. And tachshit means an adornment or a jewel, which is to say, and now citing the Talmud Baba Batra 60b, that's where tachshit is a jewel, that when one faces a test, one's true nature is revealed like a jewel. And so for some, verse 60 is you have given those who fear you a test, or who revere you a test, and nes lehit no ses. So one is the noun, the other is kind of a verb. So it's a test to display, a test to pass, for the sake of truth. So there's a transition back to structure, a psalm in which there's battle around Israel. There seems to be a loss, a sense of hardship, of drinking a wine of poison that staggers the people. And yet with verse 6, in the past tense, a reminder that we go into battle with loyalty to you, and we trust in you as the God of truth. And then the shift, verse 7, so that your beloved be set free. Deliver with your right hand and answer me. And here it goes from the national to the individual. And now an oracle, verses 8 through 11, 8 through 10. And here too, there's ambiguity. God spoke in holiness. Now, holiness here, kodsho, is understood as from his sanctuary, his tent, his temple, as if you can do a colon. And then the commentaries will differ in terms of, is the I in reference to God? I, God, shall exalt, because I will divide up Shechem. Is this a description of what God will do yet in battle on behalf of Israel? Or is this God's revelation of a promise to the king? And here, there is some reason to believe it may even be King David, rather than retroactively ascribed to him, because what will now be described are not only the tribe of Judah and Benjamin, but the northern tribes. And King David, that military warrior, he will be the one living at a time in which Israel and Judah, the 10 tribes, Ephraim and Manasseh, those being the two main tribes, two sons of Joseph who get a double portion. And so the reference here is at a time, seemingly, in which the fighting and the future is the bringing together all the nations, which may point to King David writing this in the midst of the battles described of King David. Or, as is more commonly understood by the classic commentators, it points to the messianic future of the ingathering. In fact, in a moment, I'll come back to focusing on this revelation. The classic commentators, by and large, Rashi, Radak, who lives about the same time, they'll say this is an ode to the Sanhedrin. Why to the Sanhedrin? Because it is the Sanhedrin that gives David the authorization to go to war. And you'll hear also a universal tone up ahead, that this is David's prayer for universal peace, pointing to a messianic prophecy. But now to refocus on verse 8. God spoke in holiness. I shall exalt. I will divide up Shechem, and the valley of Sukkot I will apportion. Mine is Gilead, and mine is Manasseh. Ephraim is the might of my head. Yehuda is my scepter. Moab is my wash basin. Upon Edom I fling my sandal. Over Philistia I shout out exultingly. And so this is a promise of victory with ambiguity of, is it going to be God doing the heavy lifting? Or is it God's promise of David's success? Or, if you will, a future king's success? And now, verse 11, an ambiguity, not a surprise, in that it now goes back to, like, God, now where are you? So it's framed as a question. Who will bring me to the fortified city? Who will guide me to Edom? As if to say, and now 12, is it not you, God, who has abandoned us? And you who does not go forth, God, with our armies? And so there's this tension. After the oracle, after hearing God's voice, it's like, okay, God, but who is going to lead us? Because you're not seemingly fighting with us. And you can see this again in the midst of struggle, in the midst of having just had a defeat, and yet ending with hope. Verse 13 and 14. Give us help against the foe, for futile is the deliverance of a mortal. Through God we shall act valiantly, for God will trample our foes. Through God, we shall act valiantly. It's like Eshes Chayil, Proverbs chapter 31, a woman of valor, a woman who is valiant. With God, we will act valiantly. Also, Chayil in modern Hebrew is a soldier. So there's the sense of we will act with military strength, but only with you, God, is giving us that quality of strength, that quality of courage, that quality that will allow us to trample our foes. And the word yavus is, again, the word trample also I find jarring. Some translate it as rout out. That's Benjamin Siegel. Clearly being victorious. And this is the language of disdain for the enemy. These are the tribes in verses 8 and 9. It's also a repeating here in verse 8 of Jacob's journey returning to the land. He will go to Sukkot and then to Shechem. These Menashe, Ephraim, Yehuda, north and south tribes, and these are the enemies of 10 that are disparaged. Moab is by the Dead Sea. Some say that's the image of the wash basin. Edom to the south and on the other side of the Jordan. Philistia along the coast. Here too, Het Orari, Het Roai has three possible meanings, and that can be like trua, which is the sound of the shofar, the sound of victory. Rashi has it as ro'eh, friend. I will make Philistia my friend. I will befriend them. I will make them no longer my enemy. To pull this together, because we're now at the top, what is dramatic is the sense of uncertainty in this psalm. And you can feel that between the back and forth, a description of feeling abandoned by God, trusting in God, being a little bit even sarcastic. Who's going to take us there, God? Is it not you? And yet ending with the sense of trust. And the oracle in verse 8 is this quality of ambiguity. For Martin Cohen, my colleague in Rhode Island and friend, this is the core of the psalm, namely that this is a psalm about a revelation in the temple. He imagines this being written by a priest late at night, engaged in certain kind of mystical practices, so as to have an encounter mystically. And there is this experience of God. For me, at the core is this slogan, for the sake of truth, that ultimately seeing God as one's banner, as one's test and banner, and they're intertwined as a statement of what one stands for, and seeing God as a God of truth is ultimately what is the quality of faith that makes the holder, the waver of the banner, beloved by God and worthy of being set free and delivered by God, with the statement being one can't rely on mortals alone. It's futile. One needs the Spirit of God in order to be chayil, to be valiant. But last, the title is jarring. You made us drink wine of poison. You made us drink wine that staggered us. You made us drink wine that benumbed us. And that image that God would spike the drink of victory, the drink of rejoicing, I think points to a distinctive moment that many of us experience in life, those moments where you feel like, God, you spiked the drink. And I think that's distinctive in terms of a mindset. in this moment for this psalmist. With that, I turn to you for a reaction or two of Psalm 60.
Rabbi?
Phyllis, good
Hi,
morning.
good morning. So I have a copy of the Art Scroll Tehillim that my mother gave me. And I just find the difference, the wine of poison versus, as they describe it, which you just mentioned, the wine of stupefaction. See, to me, I think of wine as, poison as something that could possibly just kill you. Stupefaction is, to me, it's just making you have bad judgment,
Yeah,
which is a recurring theme if you've had too much to drink.
yeah.
But it's
So, one is the actual noun and the other is the impact. In that sense, again, with every translation being an interpretation, if all liquor can be seen as drug, and the same word, of course, in Hebrew for drug, well, is medicine, but drug can stupefy and can ra'al is different than drug. It's poison. But if you have food poisoning, I don't know how many of you have been poisoned by food in your lives. I have a couple times, bad restaurants. You get like the flu, you get really sick. So the outcome of food poisoning is you are wasted. And in that sense, poisoned here would be befuddled. But they're softening it, and that's the impact. But the language of calling it Ra'al Tar'ela seems to me to be much more accusatory, much more a spiked drink than simply a befuddlement. But it can be it's all, in both cases, it's a metaphor of having gone into battle without one's full resources because of God. Other thoughts or things that kind of jarred you or uplifted you in this psalm? Julia?
Well, you said it was messianic and it was about the ingathering of the nations, but it seems
Yeah.
like it's about the ingathering of the tribes and that the nations are actually excluded in terms of Moab and Edom and Philistia. So how do you see it as a messianic? It seems more nationalist than messianic to me.
Yeah. And it'll lead into 61. So tomorrow, some will see as a continuum, which will lead to more a focus on the nations than is here. But the context here, because it's all the nations around Israel. In that sense, it's not just internal battles in verse 2. It's seen as symbolic of creating harmony all around. And then that'll get extended out in the commentary of ultimately David doing whatever David does on two planes, the plane of his own life and as the symbol of the messianic future. And all the more because of the skepticism that gets downplayed in many of the traditional commentaries. So, I failed you, God, so rightly you punished me, but now, come back to me and allow me with you to create a world of harmony. So that's kind of a riff in terms of a kind of a classic riff in terms of who David is and by extension, the nature of the poems. But it's a stretch. It's a stretch from where it is. But the last thing that, I'm struck by in this regard, often modern commentators understandably will say the Psalms were collected way after David's life. It wasn't like he put together the book in his time, though classic commentators would say that, but not in terms of the history of it. And that these are motifs that get retroactively put into David's life only as an archetype of the Jewish people later, reclaiming this is who we are and the sign of hope. But in this case, this psalm, because of its references to the northern tribes. And because of the battles described, may well be an ancient poem. And for me, that sets it apart from many of the other poems ascribed to David in terms of the themes that are presented. And in that sense, that's again against that historical reading, against this more large messianic imagery of a world peace that is more the lens of the classic commentators, even for an ancient psalm. So, one last closing comment among us. Richard, go ahead.
Nobody else has a comment. I'll stand down if anybody else has one.
You always have a good comment, so go ahead, Richard.
Okay. Well, it's kind of a two-parter, but anyway, I do appreciate you developing this idea of a matter of truth in its global understanding, and then paralleling and intimately connecting that with Hashem himself. And the idea, at least in part in my mind, is to pursue Hashem is to pursue truth, and pursue truth ultimately is a pursuit of Hashem, just fundamentally and by definition. And then the other part was that verse 12, and that tension and dissonance. Is it not you, God, who's abandoned us, and who goes forth, God of our armies? Who's going to lead us? Is it not you? There's sort of that holding his feet to the fire in a way. Just it's almost a challenge to God, and I appreciate that statement as well. Anyway, I'll leave it at that.
Well, those are both, as always, valued comments in terms of truth being the goal of the religious quest. What you prompted me to say by way of concluding, Richard, in that comment, though, is it's remarkable that the banner is an obscure Hebrew term. It's not a Hebrew term. I don't know, in Chicago, you see a lot of Chaldean churches. Chaldean churches are like Syrian in its origin. And if I'm now being playful, but maybe this banner is a banner for the enemy, meaning it's not the Hebrew word emet, it's the Chaldean term, according to Psalm Samson Raphael Hirsch, that's written on the banner, which is what the enemy, the Chaldeans, would read to say. Again, the banner is not, in this case, just for the fighter, it's for their enemy. And that's back to Julia's question about messianic. The rabbinic commentary is that the Israelites are always being tested. Abraham, throughout David, with all these battles. Why? In order to prove worthy through passing the tests of truth, of loyalty to God, so that the Gentiles will be able to acknowledge God's justice and truth. That's the comment of Sforno. Sforno is a medieval commentary, and one second. It's no less than Rashi. Rashi, not Sforno. Rashi, 1040 to 1105, writes as follows. God tests Israel continually to prepare for final judgment when Gentiles will acknowledge the truth and equity of God's verdict. In that sense, it's messianic from a medieval point of view, that all will acknowledge the one true God, and that what they will acknowledge is the loyalty to Israel having been displayed through repeated tests. So Nes, the key word, is both banner and tests, and this is both national and simultaneously a trajectory in the classic mind that's toward the universal. With that, Psalm 61 tomorrow is enthroned forever before God. It's seemingly a king's prayer, or a prayer on behalf of a king, of stability in government. And you'll see how that'll play out tomorrow, enthroned before God. And with that, closing by honoring our loved ones, which is the tradition of study, in order to conclude remembering the gift of learning as paying tribute to those who gave us love and life. Kaddish Yatom for those who would wish to share in Mourner's Kaddish. Yitkadal v'yitkadash shemei rabbah v'alma divra kirute v'yamlich malchute b'chayechon uv'yomechon uv'chayei dechol beit Yisrael ba'agala uv'yizman kariv v'imru amen. Yehi shmei rabba mevarach le'olam omei omaya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitba'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh v'yitadar v'yitaleh v'yitalal shemei dekudcha derichu le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata tushbechata v'nechemata damiran yalma v'miramein.
Amen.
Yehi Shama Rabba Min Shemaya Chayim Aleinu Kol Yisrael V'Imru Amen. Oseh Shalom Miromav Hu Ya'aseh Shalom Aleinu Ve'Kol Yisrael Kol Yoshvei Tevel V'Imru Amen. My gratitude to each of you for sharing in our learning this morning. I look forward to seeing you tomorrow at 9:30 for Psalm 61, enthroned forever before God. Be well.